Hello everyone, welcome back to another brand new video. And today we are delving into a hot topic in the Jujutsu Kaisen community, binding vows. Binding vows have become a meme as of late, with Sukuna's constant use of them during the Shinjuku Showdown, but we'll get into that later. Now the binding vow is a concept that I enjoyed early on in the series, but as of late, they have started to grind my gears and just make less and less sense. And now I feel like they're presenting more problems than solutions in the grand scheme of things. So let's take a deep dive into all of the binding vows of the series. Quick disclaimer before we begin, it has been a running joke recently that the JJK fans don't read the manga, so I'm just going to say right now, if I end up overlooking something or forget a vow or anything in that manner, just let me know down below in the comments and don't clown on me too hard. I read the manga, I promise. Anyways, let's start off with the vows with multiple sorcerers, because they're child's play compared to the vows with oneself. Vows with others are pretty simple. The two parties make a contract, and the two parties must fulfill their end of the vow, or else they face dire consequences. We've never seen the consequences for failing a binding vow, but that's a problem for another time. So kicking things off, we have Yuji and Sukuna's binding vow. This binding vow makes perfect sense. When Sukuna says in chain, he'll take over Yuji's body without harming anybody during the duration. Now this is where we get to the first loophole, and that's my main problem with binding vows, is they just seem to be jujutsu loopholes. So Sukuna is the one that proposes this vow to Yuji, meaning Yuji accepts these terms that Sukuna created. So when Sukuna says in chain later and takes over Yuji's body, he rips off one of Yuji's fingers and feeds it to Megumi to swap bodies. Sukuna starts laughing that Yuji didn't include himself in the vow, but how is that possible? If Sukuna created the vow, how would Yuji exclude himself from it? The vow is on Sukuna's terms. He can't just withhold information when creating a binding vow. I'm sure if Yuji knew he wasn't included in the vow, he wouldn't have accepted those conditions. Also, when Sukuna is on his little 1-minute power trip, he knocks out Hana and force feeds Megumi a finger, which should both break the harming rule. This entire situation is just super weird, but the in-chain moment is still really cool, so I'll just let this one slide. Next, we have Wee Wee and Mei Mei's binding vow, where Wee Wee has to limit his cursed energy until his sister gives him permission. This makes perfect sense, and we don't really need to delve into this one, there's no issues here. Then we got Mechamaru and Mahito's, and there's also some issues here, unfortunately. I'm gonna have to slander one of my favorite scenes in the show to push my binding vow agenda here. So the vow here was Mechamaru would act as a double agent, with Mahito healing his body with idol transfiguration in exchange for his cooperation, under the condition that Mahito wouldn't lay a finger on anybody from Kyoto Jujutsu High. Now, at first this makes sense, but then we get into some weird territory because Mechamaru kinda just ends the vow. He claims that because Hanami fought with Todo, they broke the agreement. Now that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense because the agreement was just with Mahito, and Mahito never touched a Kyoto student, so that shouldn't break the agreement. But what should break the agreement is Mechamaru's refusal to give up any more information. Him basically calling it quits on the vow should break it, since Mahito didn't break it. You see what I mean when I say these vows cause more problems than solutions? And we haven't even gotten to the solo vows yet. This ends up raising the question, can you just end a binding vow whenever you feel like it? Because then a lot of binding vows would end whenever, especially the next one we'll be talking about. So if you can't end a binding vow whenever, does that mean that Hanami broke the vow for Mahito? One of these things has to be true, and neither make any sense. The next vow is Yuta and the higher-ups. Welcome back to Loophole Kaisen. The vow here is simple. Yuta must kill Yuji, so Yuta kills him, and then immediately RCTs him and heals him. Now you'd think the higher-ups would make a vow to avoid this happening or throw in some type of wording to avoid this, knowing that Yuta can use RCT and he was close to Gojo, but they completely overlooked this, allowing Yuta to outplay them. Skill issue for the higher-ups, I guess. Those were all the vows with multiple parties. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of binding vows. Vows with oneself. And this is where we start to run into some problems. Now, I was always under the impression that vows with oneself are a give and take. You give up something involving your technique to gain something in return, and for the first couple of binding vows here, that remains the case. But then we start entering Loophole Kaisen once again with some of the later vows, so let's just dive right in. The first vow is a vow that many sorcerers in the series have, and that's revealing one's hand. By revealing their technique to their opponent, the sorcerer will increase that technique's effectiveness. The risk being that divulging that information about your technique could result in you getting countered easier. This vow not only makes sense, but it's also a great writing tool as well. It helps the viewers learn about the techniques through the characters spouting them off during battle. My question is, just how much more effective does it make your technique? Because just telling the enemy your technique is a massive risk, so that's a piece of info I'd like to know. The next vow with oneself is Nanami's overtime vow. This binding vow is the one in the series that makes the most sense. It's a perfect give and take, and it's what I'd expect all binding vows to be like. While working on the clock at Jujutsu High, Nanami must limit his cursed energy to 80%, but in exchange, when he heads into overtime, his cursed energy jumps to 120%. Now this makes sense. It's a risk for Nanami not being at 100% most of the time, but if things get dire in an overtime setting, Nanami will most certainly have the advantage because he'll be at 120% of his potential. It's basically a free Black Flash awakening if he heads into overtime. Next up are Miwa's two binding vows. Her first being that in able to use Simple Domain, she has to set her feet in place and not move in order to keep her Simple Domain up. If she moves her feet, the domain will end. I have no problems with this vow. It makes sense. But her second vow. Her second vow was used in her attempted attack against Kenjaku. To enhance her sword attack against Kenjaku, she vowed to never swing a katana again. This was a perfectly fine vow until chapter 258 rolled around. In this chapter, we see Miwa using Simple Domain with her katana to help Maki inside of Sukuna's domain. Now, I guess she's not swinging the katana so it wouldn't break the vow, but once again, it's another loophole. And also, what would happen if Miwa did swing a katana again? It's said that the punishment for breaking a vow with oneself is losing that which you strive to gain through the contract. So if Miwa used a katana again, what would she lose? She already whiffed her attack on Kenjaku, so she can't lose that. These are the things that I'd like to see explained, but since a binding vow has never been broken, I just guess we'll never know. Next up is Mahito. He made a binding vow on his awakened form in exchange for toughness in that form. He gave up the ability to transfigure himself with idle transfiguration. Makes sense so far, right? Well, then this motherfucker made another separate binding vow to be able to transfigure his head and elbow blades. Now this is where we just get into the bullshit territory. What did he give up in exchange for this second vow, and how does this second vow not contradict with the first vow? Loophole Kaisen makes its triumphant return. So he can't use idle transfiguration on himself in exchange for increased durability, but he's able to use idle transfiguration on certain parts of his body. This genuinely sounds like some dumb shit a sibling would say about his made-up character to beat your made-up character. Well, my character has increased toughness, and even though he can't morph his body, he can morph his head and elbows with another vow. This shit just doesn't make any sense. Next up is Hikari. He made a binding vow with himself. In exchange for losing his hand against Kashimo, the RCT that he would have used to heal that hand was transferred to the rest of his body, and it ends up saving his life. Now, I don't have any real grievance with this binding vow. It makes sense. But I have a problem with how this issue of Hikari not having a hand was resolved in the manga. It gets resolved by, I have no fucking idea how Hikari has a hand again. Alright, stay with me here. Hikari has RCT, but he doesn't know how to do it. It just happens automatically when he rolls a jackpot in his domain. So the solution is simple, right? Just pop a domain and roll a jackpot to get that hand back. Oh wait, he doesn't have a hand, and you can't pop a domain expansion if you can't do the hand sign for it. Well, maybe Shoko healed him, right? I mean, yeah, it's a possibility, but we've seen so far that she has a 0% success rate for restoring missing hands, as she has not restored Inumaki's, or Hana's, or Yuta's, and probably Toto's missing hands, so what's gonna give her success now? If anybody else knows down below how he could have gotten his hand back, just let me know. Now it's Sukuna time. Let's go over Sukuna's 3 binding vows and their increasing absurdity. So, Sukuna vow number 1 was used in his fight against Gojo. He used this vow in order to throw out a World Slash against Gojo without its activation conditions. However, in exchange, he basically makes future World Slashes impossible. In order to use World Slash any other time, Sukuna now has to add in a chant and direct the slash with his third arm. basically making the attack extremely telegraphed and easy to counter. So like, surely he won't land a world slash on anybody else throughout the series. Yeah, he world slashes Yuta with this like 10 chapters later. Sukuna Vow number 2. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I do not understand this one at all. Let me just read you the official synopsis of this vow, and you try to understand it. By changing his domain expansion's hand sign and applying curse techniques and barrier techniques through a part of his brain undamaged by unlimited void, then including imprecise elements and improvised binding vows, Sukuna was able to activate Malevolent Shrine without any decrease to its range or output for 99 seconds. Okay. So I understand that changing his domain expansion's hand sign means he was able to pop Shrine for 99 seconds. But what did he sacrifice in exchange? And also, what are imprecise elements and improvised binding vows? No, seriously, explain to me in the comments what that means. You can't. Not even you can make sense of that. Now, Sukuna Vow number 3. This vow was made to buff his Divine Flame ability. This vow meant that he is not able to use Divine Flame against multiple opponents unless he's inside of his domain. In exchange, Divine Flame inside of his domain gets a mega buff, and it basically becomes a goddamn bomb inside of his domain. Now, this vow does make sense, but it's just a net positive for Sukuna. If sorcerers knew about this vow, they'd stick together in a group to avoid getting hit with Divine Flame because he can only use it on one opponent at a time. Then, if the sorcerers group up, he can pop Domain with them all in it and nuke them with a buffed Domain Divine Flame. I don't understand what the negative here is for Sukuna. When was he ever going to use Divine Flame outside of his domain anyways? The only time he does that is against Jogo in a duel where Jogo basically let himself get hit by it. Anyways, we are on to our final 2 vows of the video, and both of these are super recent vows. We're on chapter 263 as of me recording this video, and I think the fact that we've had 4 binding vows in the last 6 chapters is straight up ridiculous. Next up is Todo's new vow with Boogie Woogie. This binding vow lets him increase his Boogie Woogie range and select multiple targets for swapping, and in exchange, he sacrificed how many swaps he could make per use of his Vibroslap. Now I guess, technically this makes sense, but once again, this is hardly a nerf. In fact, it 100% is Todo exploiting the system. Even though he sacrificed how many swaps he can make per slap of the Vibroslap, the swapping per use is still bad enough that Sukuna himself claims it to be impossible to adapt to the technique. So while the vow makes sense, there's basically no negative here for Todo. And our final binding vow comes from the most recent chapter, and it was made by Yuji Itadori. This vow was made to make Yuji's dismantles against Sukuna more effective at tearing the soul from his body. We don't know yet what he exchanged here, but I don't really have a problem with this vow, although it is another plot convenience. But that's what all binding vows are. Well, there you go, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed my thorough look through all of the binding vows in the series. If I missed anything important, let me know down below. Also, let me know down below what you guys think about binding vows. Do you agree or disagree with my negative thoughts towards them? Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. And as always, have a wonderful day.